Virginity, a concept as old as civilization itself, has been revered in some societies and used as a tool of control and dominance. Historically, societies placed immense value on a woman's virginity, often leading to desperate measures to feign, restore, or fake this state of untouched purity. How far would some go to maintain this illusion? Let's journey through history to uncover how ancient civilizations revered virginity, starting from ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, around 3100 BC, purity and chastity were central to societal norms. Women were expected to bear a cloth over their clothing as a symbol of their untouched status. This concept evolved significantly in ancient Greece. By the 8th century BC, virginity became associated with spiritual power and societal honor, exemplified by the goddess Athena, who symbolized wisdom, warfare mastery, and independence. Athena's virginity was more than a personal trait. It represented female autonomy in a male-dominated world. Similarly, Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, embodied virginity as a symbol of strength and independence. In these mythologies, virginity wasn't just physical, it was a form of spiritual empowerment. Rome, which rose to prominence in the 8th century BC, also deeply valued virginity. The Vestal virgins, priestesses of the goddess Vesta, were required to maintain chastity. Breaking their vow had severe consequences, including the extreme punishment of being buried alive. Meanwhile, in ancient China, virginity also played a critical role in marriage rituals. The Chinese believed that the bride's virginity, symbolized by the color red, ensured prosperity and fertility. Across these civilizations, virginity held far-reaching symbolic importance. Whether it was a divine attribute of goddesses or a societal expectation, the notion of purity has always been intricately woven into the fabric of culture, rituals, and mythologies. Exploring deeper into history, we encounter a fascinating array of virginity rituals. Let's first visit ancient Babylon, where a sacred marriage ceremony took place annually, linking the high priestess representing the goddess Inanna with the city's ruler, embodying the god Dumuzi. This ritual underscored the societal importance of virginity. Similarly, in medieval Europe, from the 5th to the 15th century, virginity was heavily tested through public rituals. Newlywed couples were covered with cloths during their first night, and the cloth was expected to bear evidence of the bride's virginity the following morning. In Japan's Heian period, 794 to 1185, aristocratic women would blacken their teeth in a custom known as ohaguro, symbolizing their transition from maidenhood to womanhood. In the Yoruba Kingdom of West Africa, virginity tests were steeped in symbolism. A white cloth was given to the bride, and if it was stained with blood the next morning, it confirmed her purity. Similarly, the ancient Mayans had a custom of inspecting the bride's bedsheet for blood after the first night of marriage, with the absence of blood seen as a bad omen. The Bible, one of the most influential texts across cultures, also contributed to shaping the perception of virginity. The story of the Virgin Mary is a central theme in Christian theology. According to the Gospel of Luke, Mary conceived Jesus while maintaining her virginity, elevating the sanctity of virginity to divine heights. The Bible also enshrined the importance of virginity in matrimonial matters, with the book of Deuteronomy prescribing severe punishment for a bride who couldn't prove her virginity. These biblical narratives further reinforced the societal reverence for purity and chastity, making virginity not just a physical state, but a moral and spiritual ideal. The Middle Ages, spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, saw the role of virginity shift from religious and spiritual spheres into the political realm. Virginity became a highly prized asset, often used to negotiate power dynamics and alliances. Marriages were frequently arranged for strategic purposes, such as consolidating power or securing territorial acquisitions. During this time, a bride's virginity was seen as a symbol of her family's honor, making it a valuable bargaining tool in political marriages. In this context, virginity wasn't just a personal trait, but a commodity that could influence the course of history. One of the most significant examples is the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Louis VII of France in 1137. Eleanor, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Western Europe, brought her virginity as a valuable asset in the negotiation of this marriage. The union was politically motivated as it united the vast territory of Aquitaine with the French crown. Eleanor's virginity was seen as a symbol of her family's prestige and honor. This marriage had far-reaching political consequences, altering the balance of power in Europe. The concept of virginity was further idealized in the literature of the time, particularly in the genre of courtly love. This literary tradition, which was popular in medieval Europe, often depicted knights embarking on dangerous quests to win the favor of a noble and unattainable virgin lady. These tales reinforced the reverence for virginity, emphasizing it as a highly valued and revered state that could only be possessed by a select group of women. The most famous works of this genre, such as Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur and Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, celebrated the unattainable virgin and the chivalric efforts to win her favor. The depiction of women as unattainable virgins in courtly literature mirrored societal norms that idealized women as symbols of purity and virtue. Virginity, therefore, became not only a personal trait, but a key to social status and power. In the world of medieval nobility, a woman's virginity could determine her worth and her family's social standing. However, this idealization of virginity often resulted in unrealistic expectations and pressure on women. The Renaissance, beginning in the 14th century, brought new artistic, cultural, and intellectual developments that also impacted the way virginity was viewed. During this time, virginity continued to be heavily associated with honor, virtue, and moral purity. Yet the period also saw the emergence of more sophisticated and, in some cases, insidious methods to maintain the illusion of virginity. The most notorious of these practices was the so-called chastity belt, which has long been a subject of fascination and folklore. Chastity belts were purportedly worn by women to prevent sexual activity, particularly during times when their husbands or male protectors were away. These devices, made of metal and sometimes adorned with locks, were said to be an extreme measure to preserve a woman's virginity. However, historians and scholars have debated whether chastity belts were actually used widely or if they were largely a myth created during the Victorian era. Many of the chastity belts on display in museums today have been proven to be forgeries, likely created to titillate Victorian audiences with their perceived prudishness and eccentricities. Despite the uncertain history of chastity belts, the Renaissance did witness an increased focus on preserving the illusion of virginity through other, more practical means. For example, it became common for women to use various concoctions to tighten their reproductive systems and simulate the appearance of virginity. These concoctions, often made from herbs, vinegar, and other ingredients, were believed to create the illusion of an intact hymen. Some of these mixtures were even marketed by apothecaries, the pharmacists of the day, who offered remedies to preserve a woman's purity. In 18th century France, some women resorted to using chicken blood to simulate the blood that was traditionally thought to accompany the loss of virginity. This macabre practice underscored the immense pressure women faced to meet societal expectations of virginity and purity. The use of blood to simulate virginity was not limited to Europe. In many cultures around the world, similar methods were employed to create the illusion of purity. These practices reflected a deeply ingrained belief that a woman's worth was intrinsically tied to her perceived virginity. This obsession with virginity during the Renaissance also influenced medical practices. Physicians of the time, such as Dr. William Acton, contributed to the myth that the hymen was the definitive marker of virginity. Acton's work, The Functions and Disorders of the Reproductive Organs, 1857, reinforced the idea that a woman's virginity could be determined by examining her hymen. This belief persisted well into the 20th century and influenced how women's bodies were treated by the medical community. The Renaissance also saw a cultural shift in the way virginity was represented in art. Artists began to depict virginity as a symbol of moral purity and divine favor. Virgin saints, such as Saint Cecilia and Saint Agnes, became popular subjects in religious art, further idealizing the notion of virginity as a sacred and divine attribute. These depictions reinforce the cultural narrative that virginity was not just a physical state, but a spiritual one, elevating women who maintained their purity to the status of saints and martyrs. However, this reverence for virginity was not without its contradictions. While virginity was celebrated and idealized in literature and art, women were also subjected to extreme societal pressures to maintain their purity. Women who failed to meet these expectations were often stigmatized and ostracized. The cultural obsession with virginity contributed to a complex and often contradictory understanding of women's bodies, one that simultaneously elevated and restricted them. By the end of the Renaissance, the idea of virginity as both a personal and societal construct had firmly taken root in European culture. Virginity had become a symbol of moral and social standing, a commodity that could be used to negotiate power and a measure of a woman's worth. As the centuries progressed, the concept of virginity would continue to evolve, but its legacy as a powerful societal force would remain. As European colonialism spread across the globe, the concept of virginity was further shaped by Western ideals. Colonial powers imposed their cultural norms on the lands they colonized, and virginity became a symbol of control. When European explorers like Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas, they encountered indigenous cultures that had different norms around virginity and courtship. The Europeans, however, saw these customs as barbaric and sought to impose their own moral code, where virginity held paramount significance. In Africa, the arrival of European colonial powers in the 19th century disrupted local traditions surrounding womanhood and courtship. Many African societies had their own customs and rituals celebrating virginity and womanhood, but these practices were dismissed by the colonizers as uncivilized. The British colonization of India is another poignant example. Victorian-era morality, which equated a woman's worth to her virginity, was imposed upon Indian society. Indigenous customs, such as tantric traditions, which viewed physical intimacy as a spiritual journey, were sidelined. The pressure to conform to Western ideals of virginity led to societal shifts in many colonized regions. In India, stories like that of Rukmabai, who refused to live with her husband after being forced into marriage, sparked debates on women's rights and chastity. Rukmabai's refusal to accept her prescribed role as a wife became a symbol of resistance against the colonial imposition of patriarchal values. Rukmabai's actions, in the face of overwhelming societal pressure, brought to light the intersection of colonialism and the way women's bodies were policed and commodified in marriage. In the late 19th century, Victorian ideals about virginity continued to spread through the British Empire, influencing other parts of the world. British colonialists often viewed themselves as bringing civilization to the indigenous people they encountered.
However, this supposed civilizing mission was deeply tied to the imposition of Western ideals of morality, particularly the emphasis on virginity as a marker of a woman's honor.
In Africa, as in India, the introduction of European norms about virginity marginalized indigenous ways of understanding women's bodies and sexuality. The legacy of this colonial approach to virginity can still be felt in many parts of the world today.
The moral codes introduced by colonial powers in the 19th and early 20th centuries continue to shape attitudes toward virginity and womanhood.
Even in the post-colonial era, many former colonies continue to grapple with these colonial ideals, where the concepts of purity and chastity remain deeply ingrained in social expectations for women. As we entered the 20th century, the perception of virginity began to evolve. Scientific advancements helped debunk the myths surrounding virginity, particularly the misconception that the hymen was a definitive marker of purity. Studies have shown that the hymen can take many forms, and its condition is not an accurate indicator of sexual activity. Despite this, the myth of the hymen persisted for decades, influencing cultural norms and practices across the globe. The rise of feminism in the 20th century challenged traditional views on virginity, with movements advocating for women's autonomy and control over their own bodies. Feminist figures like Gloria Steinem spoke out against the societal pressures surrounding virginity, declaring that a woman's worth should not be tied to her purity. Steinem's revolutionary statements, such as, "A liberated woman is one who has relations before marriage," and "a job after," helped shift societal attitudes towards sexual freedom and personal agency. This shift in thinking was echoed by other prominent figures of the time, including Simone de Beauvoir, who argued that society's obsession with virginity was a manifestation of male dominance. Despite the growing push for women's liberation, the concept of virginity continued to be reinforced in many parts of the world, particularly in conservative societies. In some cultures, the expectation of virginity remained a powerful and controlling force, influencing marriage traditions and family honor. The pressure for women to prove their virginity through virginity testing practices continued well into the late 20th century, particularly in some African and Middle Eastern countries. In response to these practices, international organizations, including the World Health Organization, WHO, began to issue guidelines condemning virginity testing as a harmful and unscientific practice. The WHO's opposition to virginity testing, issued in 2019, was a pivotal moment in the global conversation about women's rights and bodily autonomy. Despite these efforts, however, virginity testing continues in some regions, reflecting the persistent influence of historical, patriarchal beliefs surrounding women's purity. In more progressive societies, the narrative around virginity has shifted significantly in recent decades. Virginity is increasingly being recognized as an outdated and harmful social construct, one that has been used to control and oppress women for centuries. In many parts of the world, the pressure to remain a virgin until marriage is being replaced by a focus on sexual autonomy, consent, and personal choice. However, the journey to redefine virginity is far from complete. In some countries, particularly in the Middle East and parts of Asia, virginity is still viewed as a woman's most valuable asset, and societal expectations around purity remain deeply entrenched. In these regions, women may still face harsh consequences if their virginity is questioned or compromised. The cultural fixation on virginity remains a powerful force, despite growing awareness of its negative impact on women's rights and freedoms. In the Western world, while many have rejected the traditional idea of virginity, there is still a cultural fascination with the concept. The media, particularly in film and television, often portrays virginity as something that must be lost in a dramatic or significant way. These portrayals perpetuate the idea that virginity is an essential part of a woman's identity, even as more people advocate for sexual freedom and equality. This cultural tension speaks to the deep-seated historical beliefs about virginity that continue to influence societal norms. As we reflect on the complex history of virginity, from ancient Egypt to modern-day attitudes, it's clear that the societal obsession with purity has deeply affected women's lives. Yet, as we move forward, there is hope that we can shift toward a more inclusive and respectful understanding of women's bodies, free from the constraints of outdated ideals. Feminism, education, and scientific progress are slowly but surely dismantling the long-standing myths about virginity and allowing women to reclaim their identities and their bodies. The ongoing challenge is to ensure that the legacy of control and oppression tied to virginity is fully erased, paving the way for a future where women are valued for who they are, rather than for an outdated and harmful construct. The journey of redefining virginity and sexual autonomy is an ongoing process. As we look toward the future, it is essential to continue the work of dismantling the patriarchal systems that have shaped our understanding of women's bodies for centuries. The history of virginity serves as a powerful reminder of the ways in which social constructs can be used to control, oppress, and limit women's freedom. By learning from this history, we can create a more equitable and empowering world for all.